this morning when we start. Ronnie, what's the first section?
Tennessee.
Ronnie's always on the right track. Pentateuch.
The Torah.
The Torah, the Law, books of Moses. Those are common names to a Pentateuch. Just means the 5 books. So what's the first book of the Pentateuch? Genesis.
Exodus. Leviticus. Numbers.
Deuteronomy.
Very good. What's the next section?
History.
History. All right. It's the first book of the history.
Joshua. Judges. Ruth. First and second Samuel.
First and second Kings.
First, second Chronicles. Ezra. Nehemiah. Esther. Job.
Very good. All right. What's the next section?
Wisdom.
All right.
Job. Psalm. Proverbs. Ecclesiastes. Song of Solomon.
Very good. What's the next section?
Minor prophets. Major prophets.
There you go.
Isaiah.
Isaiah.
Jeremiah. Lamentations.
There you go.
Ezekiel.
Daniel.
Daniel. Very good. What's the next section?
Minor.
Very good.
Isaiah.
Isaiah.
Joel. Amos. And I missed everything else. Obadiah.
Yeah. Obadiah.
Jonah.
Jonah. The fish.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually I had to say the whale. Once I said that, they got that one.
Micah.
I don't know why this one is so hard for everybody.
Zechariah.
Uh-uh.
No, not next.
Starts with N.
No?
Habakkuk.
Nope. Before that one.
N.
Start with an N.
Got that.
Nahum.
Maybe.
Yeah, what did you say, Fred?
Habakkuk.
That's it.
Habakkuk. Everybody likes to pronounce that one. Habakkuk. All right, that's the next one.
Z.
First of the Z's.
Zechariah.
Nope.
Zechariah.
Zephaniah.
No,
Zephaniah.
Zephaniah.
No.
Yeah, y'all were all over. All right. What's the next one?
Haggai.
Hey, guy.
Big guy.
Hey, guy. All right, the second Z. Y'all done said it twice.
Zechariah.
Zechariah. There we go. And what's the last one?
Malachi.
Malachi, not pronounced.
Malachi.
Very good. All right. And what did we cover last week? What was that period called?
Apocrypha. Something like that.
The forgotten.
Well,
In between time.
in between time. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. What's the 50-cent word for it? Do you remember?
The lost years or
No. Another word for that is the silent years.
silent years.
That's another term for it. From about 400 BC to 1 BC. That's about the time that there was no prophets or anything. The Inter-Testamental Period. All right, that's the 50-cent word for it. Now, Barbara, what's one of the collections of books that is contained within this period? You just said it.
The Apocrypha.
The Apocrypha. I remember we covered that a little bit on that one Sunday. A lot of different books contained with that. What was the other majority of books that was also written during this time?
Starts with a P, but I can't.
It starts with a P. The Pseudepigrapha.
And we're supposed to remember that.
Yep. Yep. It's two words. It's two Greek words put together: pseudo and grapha. Pseudo means false. Grapha means writings. So false writings. The Pseudepigrapha. what we're going to kind of do today is just kind of talk about the different sections of the New Testament. You can break it down into sections, but it doesn't fit as nice as it does as it breaks down in the Old Testament. So we're not going to be able to exactly break it down in sections like we did before, because there's a few books that'll be a little bit out of place if we do that. So we're going to go through them like we did with the Old Testament, but we're going to have to do them in a little bit different way for the most part. So when we jump into the New Testament, we flip in our Bibles, and what's the first group of books that we find?
The book of
There's
those.
4 of them. When we turn in our New Testament,
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
the Gospels. So that's the first section that we run into when we get into the New Testament. And the Gospels basically cover the birth, the life, the ministry, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. In some ways, this is these are 4 different accounts, 4 different biographies of his life. In that day and age, biographies were written a little bit different than they are today. Biographies could be shorter, some could be a little bit longer. Biographies in that day, a lot of times would be, it wouldn't cover all of a person's life. A lot of times it would just cover the most important parts of that person's life. And so as you read through the Gospels, you'll see that not everything is recorded. A lot of it's the most important parts of Jesus' life, or the things that were written down, or things like that. There were also, a lot of times, biographies were written in such a way that they were recorded in thematic fashion, like we see with the book of Matthew. Matthew is not chronologically written in some parts. You'll find where there will be things that you'll find prior in the book that actually happened later. And so Matthew is more of a thematic writer. He writes in series of themes. As where, like with Luke, Luke is very detail-oriented. His seems like more of a historical work that you would find like today. And then you have some other things, some different themes. And as we go through these books, we'll talk about what those themes are. We'll talk about the audiences that they spoke to, because those things matter as you read those books. Because if you like with all the other books we've already studied, if you understand the context, you understand the audience, you understand those things, it helps you understand much better what Jesus and the disciples and other people were talking about. So the Gospels, one thing that we'll cover, and you'll hear me say a lot, is when we start talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they have so many similarities, there's not a lot of huge differences between them. There are some. Each one is a little different from the other, but they contain a lot of the same material, and for that they are called the Synoptic Gospels. And so if you hear me say that term, I'm talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic. And that just basically means similar.
Didn't they correct too, there's like the harmony of the Gospels, because those 3 are the same? Ain't that another terminology for it?
Well, the harmony of the Gospels extends to all 4.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but and there's a reason for that. When you're talking about the Synoptic Gospels, the reason John is not considered within the Synoptic Gospels is because 92% of John is unique. It is not found in the other 3 Gospels. So there's a lot of information in John that you're not going to find. 92% worse. So there's only 8% of information in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that is familiar to John. So that's why like with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they share, over 50% of similarities within the context of those three books. So that's the reason why. Now, it doesn't mean John is outside of the Gospels or that he is different. John is considered more of a supplemental material to go along with the Synoptic Gospels. And it doesn't make it any more important, doesn't make it any less important. It's the same equal footing as all the rest. It's just how they're designated. And so I just wanted to share those things with you so that way if you ever hear them somewhere else, you'll know why that is. As we get into each book, we'll talk about things that kind of make them important. Some of them, like with some of their audiences, deal with different subjects, different themes, different spiritual matters. There are certain elements, like certain parables, that you will find only in certain books. There are some things that you will find in all the books. There are statements that are made, like in the book of John. You'll find the 7 I am statements. You don't find those in the other. You don't really see those in that context in the other books. Things like that. So they're all a little bit different. Some of them are some of the same things, but we'll get into that within each book. Now the next section is one book, basically. Does anybody?
Acts.
Huh?
Acts.
It is the book of Acts. You know what Acts? Do you know what Acts is considered as? What do you consider Joshua? What section was that in?
History.
History. If you read the book of Acts, it is history. And it has been confirmed, I want to say 100%, or maybe close to 100% of all the places, all the locations that have been named in the book of Acts have been found. And so it is historically accurate. And there are other things within the book of Acts that we find that have come later that have significance. But Acts is really a history book. It was written by Luke. And so a lot of people considered, for a time, this was kind of considered like second Luke, or Luke part 2, because people believe that when Luke was done writing the gospel, he jumped right into this and he recorded this history. And this is where we find a lot of the history about what Paul did, his missionary journeys and different things like that. The beginnings of Paul, and then the ending of Paul's ministry. And so Luke and Paul were very close. Some say that Luke may have been Paul's personal doctor, which would explain the closeness. But Luke recorded a lot of what Paul had said and did. But you would find typically Acts is written in a lot of ways like Luke. It's very detail-oriented. And so there's a lot of good preaching in the book of Acts, as you well know. Now the next section that we'll jump into, now Paul wrote most of the New Testament. So there's a lot of sections that are dedicated just to Paul and Paul's epistles. Now, epistles are basically just a 50-cent word for letters. So Paul's letters. But if you ever read anything, most of the time it says Paul's epistles, so that's all that means is letters. So within this framework, you have the book of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Now, if not for 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, we could do this. We could do them chronologically. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians does not come after Galatians in your Bible. So if you look for them, you're not going to find them there. You got to flip a few more pages. First and Second Thessalonians can also kind of be considered as end time or apocalyptic type literature. And you know, whenever we start talking about in the New Testament, whenever we start talking about the theology of the rapture or the second coming, the Antichrist, you can find quite a bit of that material in First and Second Thessalonians. But these letters, these are letters that Paul wrote. Paul wrote a letter to the Romans, to the Roman church. He wrote letters to the Corinthian church. He wrote a letter to the church in Galatia, and then also to the churches there in Thessalonica. And so those are considered Paul's epistles. Now another section that we'll get into is the prison epistles or prison letters. And what I really appreciate so much about these is that the richness of the information and the spiritualness of these books while being in prison just fascinates me. And you know, you start to think people who are having a tough time, and you think about Paul being in prison, and these works are some of his more joyful works. And you think, oh, well, he's in prison, but he's writing something that's more joyful than some of his other works when he wasn't in prison. So it's pretty awesome. But these works include Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Of course, each of these were written to, 3 of these were written to churches in those cities, the Ephesian church, the Philippian church, and the church there in Colossae. So that would, Philippians, that would be Philippi, and Ephesians would be Ephesus. And Philemon, Philemon, was one little bitty book that I don't think anybody ever preaches out of. I don't think I've ever preached out of that book, to be honest with you. But that was a slave owner-slave relationship that Paul was speaking to. And so when we get into that book, we'll talk about those things, because that was a big part of New Testament times, was the slave trade. Now the next section that we'll talk about is one that is very important to the structure of the church. And I think churches really need to pay attention to these when they're thinking about leadership. And that's called the Pastoral Epistles. Does anybody know what those are? Now these books are preached fairly regularly. First and Second Timothy and the book of Titus. Those are the pastoral epistles, because they deal predominantly with leadership in the church, how to discern and pick leadership such as pastors, the elders or deacons. Elders and deacons pretty much hold the same function. It's just a different way of explaining the same thing. Different denominations call them different things. Some denominations call them boards. In the church, we call it ministry and council, which is elders, typically Baptists, or deacons.
Ministry team.
So, there's just depending on what denomination in, you might get a different thing, but they all kind of represent the same type of function. It's the leadership in the church. And you know as well as I do that if there's faulty leadership in the church, on many levels, it can create a lot of problems. And so it's important to understand what the Bible says about leadership. And I think sometimes when people read these books, I think they tend to think that leaders must be perfect. Have you ever met a perfect person in your life?
No.
You know, and I think about this, and I'm like, okay, I see churches with the criteria of trying to hire a perfect person, and I'm thinking to myself, well, you know, these books were written by Paul. Paul was, we don't know if he actually laid any hands on any Christians and killed them, but we know that he did direct people to kill Christians and oppress them. So we hardly find, before Paul was converted, we hardly find him as a perfect person now, do we? And of course we know the disciples were not perfect. So I mean, you know, the only person that ever existed that was perfect was Jesus himself. And so, you know, I think when churches are deciding on that, like I said, I think sometimes they're looking for a perfect person. Sometimes those that they might consider perfect may not be the best person for the job, because if you've ever followed racing, you've heard Darrell Waltrip talk about experience. Not experience, experience.
But you gotta
Sometimes that's a good preacher.
You gotta look at this, you know, a Christian, he grows, his purpose is to grow every day in Christ.
He's supposed to.
And he wants to reach his ultimate goal till Lord takes him home.
That's right. And you know, that's all of us. You know, we're not gonna reach that entire sanctification until we cross over that threshold from this life to the next, and we're standing in glory. That's the only time we're going to reach that. But you know, today we have to understand that people have faults, they have failures, but we have to look at what are they doing in their life. Are they striving to better their life? Are they striving to be a more mature Christian? And those are things I think we need to look at with leadership, because nobody's perfect. But these are great books. These are short books, but I really enjoy them. They're packed full of great teaching. Now, one of the biggest sections, well, I guess this would be the biggest section, as far as the number of books, not necessarily the size of them, but the number of books, would be called the General Epistles. And when you think of general epistles, it's not necessarily like where Paul, in his letters, he wrote specifically to the Romans, or to the church of Ephesus, or to Thessalonica. These are more general. They may have been written from some of these other places. You know, we know, let's see. See, Paul didn't write any of these letters. Some people will say with the first one, Hebrews, some people say that Paul may have written that one. Nobody knows. I haven't heard a great explanation of who wrote Hebrews. There's a lot of theories about who wrote Hebrews. And we'll cover some of this when we get into Hebrews. When you start looking at the evidence as far as who would have been able to write in such a fashion, obviously Paul would have been a good candidate, but whoever wrote this was extremely versed in the Old Testament, but they were extremely versed in good Greek, not sloppy Greek, very, very good Greek, eloquent Greek. And so, you know, some people say because of that kind of kicks Paul out of that, but doesn't necessarily throw them out of the ring. Sometimes there was some early church leaders that Paul may have dealt with that they think that, okay, maybe it could have been Priscilla or Aquila that pitched in and wrote this. There are some who say that Priscilla wrote it. I think there's some evidence in there that shows that she didn't write it. But, you know, there's a lot of different theories about who wrote this book, but we just don't know. There really is no concrete answer as far as who wrote this, or even in the book itself that gives us hints of it. But anyway, we got the book of Hebrews. Now, Hebrews is a little bit different. Hebrews is written more as a sermon than a typical letter. And so when you start reading Hebrews, that's how it's going to read. It's going to read like a sermon. And Hebrews, very, very good book. And one thing I would say about the book of Hebrews, if you read Hebrews, go back and read Leviticus along with it. Because there's a lot of overlap between Leviticus and Hebrews. And if you want to understand Hebrews a little bit better, Leviticus will help you do that. No matter how much of you hate reading Leviticus, it will help you in Hebrews. And then, of course, we have the book of James. We have the books of 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Jude. So all of these, they're mostly short. The book of Hebrews is the longest of these, but the other ones only consist of a few chapters. The book of Jude is just one chapter. So these are, considered the general epistles, just, written out there, just general in audience. But all of them are filled with impactful teaching. And the very last section is one that is really the only book in the New Testament that is considered entirely apocalyptic. And of course, you know what book that is.
Revelation.
The book of Revelation. So it's a book that everybody loves to hate. You either love it or hate it.
They don't understand.
In order to understand, you must read the other 65 books. Makes much more sense. So, what we have to understand about as we go into the New Testament, when we read the Gospels, the Gospel basically means good news. It's an important announcement. And this is, as I said, the life and times of Jesus. That is what the Gospels consist of. Everything else in the New Testament feeds off of what was taught and learned in the Gospels. Everything else in the New Testament is not the Gospels. If you ever hear somebody say, well, this is the Gospel. No, the Gospels are contained in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That is the Gospel. Those are the words from Jesus, about Jesus. Everything that is contained in the rest of the New Testament is about Jesus. His teachings, his life, the things that they learned, and then as we see, there are so many things within that first century that help us understand the things that these other writers were talking about. And there was a lot going on as we found out during the silent years, the in-between times. There was a lot going on in those 400 years, but there was a lot going on in that first century. And so as people were writing, outside influence does affect writing. Does anybody read current events, stuff like current events today, books that are written about current events? I'm starting to think I'm one of the few people that actually read. Other than biblical reading, I read a lot of stuff outside of the Bible. But current events would be like stuff that's going on now. Like if you just go on Amazon and look up some of your best sellers over the last 2 to 3 years, a lot of them are on socialism. and where we're headed. Those would be considered current events. Things surrounding the presidency, things surrounding the election, things surrounding, there's a lot of books being written about, COVID area period and post-COVID area period. So there's a lot of things, these would be considered current events. And so as the New Testament was going on in the first century, they would have been writing about current events. They would have been influenced by current events, culture, and things like that. And so if you understand those things, it's easier to understand where they were coming from and what they were writing about. There's a couple 50-cent words that I think every Christian ought to know, and it has to do with how they view the Bible. And I didn't put them in here. I just thought of this. I should put them in here. But the first one is called exegesis, and it's E-X-E-G-E-S-I-S, exegesis. And basically, what this means is when we look and study the Bible, the prefix there, ex, basically means to take out. So when we're studying Scripture, it's about what we get out of the Bible. And there's a lot we can get out of the Bible. We learn about language, culture, different rules, Old Testament, New Testament. There's so many things that are involved with the exegesis. And if you're a student of the Bible, good exegesis is a must. Now here's where the problem is. For a lot of Christians, they practice eisegesis, which is they put that, they take their current events or life or whatever, and they put that into the Bible and try to read the Bible from what they put in it. That is not an accurate approach to do that. You're supposed to read the Bible for what it is. Now, eisegesis, let's see if I can spell this. It's E-I-S-E-G-E-S-I-S. And so exegesis is what you get out of the Bible. Eisegesis is putting into the Bible. One should be practiced, the other should not. And as I said, eisegesis is when you're doing that, you're taking your own thoughts, theology, and that's your input into the Bible, and you read the Bible through that lens. I'm not saying you can't relate things, but the primary goal is, what does the Bible say? And to be able to take what it says and to pull that out and then apply that, look through that lens. And I think we've got too many churches and leaders who do the opposite. And when you do that, you get some unbiblical teachings. You get unbiblical expectations. I think you get, you've heard me talk a lot about it. You get these televangelists who say a lot of things that are just not biblical. Like, looking through the world with rose-colored glasses. That is not a good approach to take, because the world is a dark place, and it is not good every day. We experience a lot of pain. We experience a lot of joy. There's a lot of things we experience. So life is not peachy every day. And, when people preach that or teach that, it's because it's eisegesis. They're putting something into the Bible that is not there. If they practice good exegesis, they wouldn't preach that way. Yes, sir.
With the media and everything today, Christians have a lot of times get crossed up on biblical and historic things.
Yes. A good example of that would be social justice issues. There's a lot of people that would preach that Jesus was a socialist. He absolutely was not a socialist.
No.
Because he expected personal accountability, individual accountability. That's not what socialism is. He expected people to work The New Testament preaches that you work and you earn money. I mean, there's a lot of anti-socialist teachings that Jesus taught, and for people who do that, they're not a student of the Bible and they're not a student of history.
Well, Jesus was a man of love, no doubt.
Absolutely.
But God is a God of wrath too.
And we will see that.
And
We will see that Jesus.
I think right now we are seeing a lot of God's wrath right now.
Well, we will definitely, when Jesus comes back, we will definitely see that
When
wrath.
he's already killing 60 million babies and people, today, I've heard people say, well, I don't believe in the Holocaust stuff,
Like it never existed.
And, if you ever went to Jerusalem and seen the Holocaust Museum,
You'll know it exists.
it's really touching.
Yeah.
Then you go to the baby museum, all babies are killed.
Now that in saying that, the social justice issues, now that doesn't mean that there weren't social issues that Jesus dealt with. Obviously, one of the tenets that we found in the Old Testament, anytime that the Old Testament people of Israel got judged very harshly, it's because they weren't taking care of the poor and the needy and the kids. And so that's still a social issue that is dealt with in the New Testament as well. As also Jesus extended that to loving thy neighbor. So I mean, there are still social issues, but still you have that accountability of your individual actions and your responses to those. So it doesn't mean that social issues don't exist, it's how we approach those things. And there's a right way and a wrong way, there's a biblical way, and then there's an unbiblical way. Unfortunately, a lot of churches have attached onto the unbiblical way of handling these things. And so that's something that these churches, they're going to find out, as they work through these things. I think some of them are starting to figure that out, but it may take some others some more time, depending on what kind of leadership they have. But at any rate, there's a lot of different issues that are tackled in the New Testament, and we're going to go through some of those things now. That as we read the New Testament, these things make a difference in how we read them. So, one of the first things, as we talked a little bit about last week, is language. The Greek language, as Alexander the Great came through and took over and conquered the known world in a very short amount of time, one of the things that he did was he Hellenized all of the nations that he conquered. Now, Hellenization is just a term for basically making them assimilate to the Greek culture, the Greek way of life. That's all that means. And you will see that into the 1st century A.D., Hellenization is a term that if you start reading about 1st century Judaism, you will find some Hellenization of the Jews, where they have adapted or accepted the Greek culture. Now, the Greek language, you'll find, what were the languages of the Bible? Who can tell me?
Hebrew.
Hebrew?
Greek.
Greek, and I heard somebody say it,
Arabic.
Aramaic. So those were the three biblical languages. Those were the original languages. But there was another language that they were dealing with in the 1st century as well. What was that? Somebody may have even taken it in school. I know they offered it. Huh?
Latin.
Latin. That was the language of the Romans. So when you're dealing with the 1st century of the turn of the new millennium, in the 1st century A.D., you still had Jews who predominantly spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, and so that was a religious language of the Jews during that time. But in the 1st century A.D., the Jews would have not just been wouldn't have just learned Hebrew and Aramaic. Almost everybody knew Greek. And the reason for that is Greek was the common everyday language. See, the Greek culture, Rome, as we talked about last week, Rome kind of adopted the Greek culture and kind of infused it with Roman culture. There was a lot of similarities between the two. Rome didn't do like a lot of other invading armies or powers would do and assimilate everybody to their lifestyle. They would kind of say, ours is a little bit better than yours, so we're just going to absorb yours and make it part of ours. And so that's why you see so much of the Greek culture infused with Roman culture, and a lot of times when you read anything about that time period, it is called the Greco-Roman world. It's because those two are kind of infused, those two cultures. But the Greek language was much easier to learn, and it was the everyday language, north, south, east, and west, anywhere you went from Jerusalem. So, there was a lot of trade that took place in Israel, a lot of trade routes that run directly through Israel, and so Greek would have been the common everyday language that people would have dealt with. So Jews, no doubt, would have known Greek. I think we have a pretty good idea that Jesus knew Greek because, as we talked about, there are several times in the New Testament and the Gospels where he quotes an Old Testament prophet, and he quotes them out of the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. So we know that Jesus was trilingual. He was probably quadrilingual. I don't know. Pretty sure he knew Latin too.
When they was in Cairo, when Jesus was 1 or 2 years old, what was that, Hebrew or?
Joseph and Mary, they probably would have spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. But in northern Africa at that time, in Egypt, it was very Hellenized. It was very heavily influenced in Greek. So they would have spoken Greek down there probably. A lot of ancient documents have been found in Alexandria. That's how we know a lot about that first century. And prior to that is because of a lot of the Greek documents that were written and have been found down there. So it was very Hellenized in northern Africa. Which when Alexander the Great took over, Egypt was part of that he took over all the way down past Thebes, which goes it's a pretty good distance down into Egypt, well past Cairo, or wasn't Cairo then, that's what it's called today, but it would have been well past that. There was a highly Hellenized Greek culture, even with the Jews. The Jews were very Hellenized during that time as well, even prior to the 1st century AD. So Greek was the everyday common language, and then Latin. Latin was the legal language. And of course Latin was the Roman language. Now, Latin was predominantly spoken more in the western part of the Roman Empire, which would, of course, Italy. Rome had conquered over into Spain, over into Germany, all that part of the known world. So Latin would have been spoken more on the west side of the Roman Empire. Greek would have been spoken more towards the eastern part of the empire, but Latin was still spoken there in this middle part of the world at that time. As we look at the Gospels and we look at the Crucifixion, and we know that there was a tag attached to the cross that Jesus was crucified on, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So it was written in the religious language, the common language, and the legal language. And so there's some theological concepts there, when you look at that deeply. But languages heavily influenced the way that they did things in that day. And it heavily influenced the way that the New Testament was written as well. With the Greek language, it allowed the New Testament to be spread more easily. because everybody knew Greek. So to say that the New Testament was written in Greek and it just happened to be coincidence, I don't believe that. Just like how Rome had all them roads built and just paved the way for the gospel. You know, they thought they were making progress for themselves, but they were actually making progress for the gospel to spread. Now, another thing that we find in this time is public conveniences. And you'll find these more in, not as much in central Israel, like around Jerusalem and places like that. You'd probably have to go outside, maybe the northern part of Israel, to the eastern part of Israel, go across the Jordan in what's known as the Decapolis. And we'll talk about that as we get into that, because that played a part into that. That's two Greek words, basically means 10 cities, the Decapolis. And some of Jesus' interactions, important interactions, happened in the Decapolis. Now, with public conveniences, the Greeks and the Romans were master architects, and they were inventors. And so along came with that things, bathhouses, indoor plumbing. Those were pretty amazing architectural feats and things like that. But they had these things long before the 1st century AD. They had them a couple centuries before this. But in Roman bathhouses and Greek bathhouses, if you read anything about the history of Rome and Greek, they had those all over the place. So imagine a Jew who grew up there in Israel and went outside of that city, that small rural countryside that he grew up in. He would have encountered these bigger cities, because these bigger cities surrounded Israel, and they would have certainly encountered a whole different type of culture. Much like today, if you grow up here in rural Randolph County and you go to New York, you're going to have culture shock. And so it would have been the same in that day and age. And so when you look at Paul and him going and teaching and preaching at some of these places, he would have encountered that. And I think one place maybe this would have played a part. If you go back to the events of the prodigal son, and it said that he went to a faraway country. A faraway country would have basically just meant a foreign city. And so, with Israel, he wouldn't have had to have gone far, because the Decapolis was right across the Jordan River. And so within the Decapolis was these 10 major cities. And so he would have found all sorts of trouble to get in over there, and we know that he did. It said, his brother accused him of spending all his money on prostitutes and all of these different things. So when he said he went to a faraway country and he did all of these things, more than likely he may have went to one of these Greek cities there in the Decapolis. And so he would have encountered a lot of these different things. His intrigue, along with bathhouses, bathhouses, there was a lot of prostitution that went along, male and female, that went along there. Sexuality, we'll get into that in a minute, because that was a big thing. And as we read the New Testament, that does play a part in a lot of things that we read. It's not something very fun to talk about, but nonetheless, it was an issue, and it's one that we have to deal with. Just public conveniences and different things like that was something that they dealt with. And Paul, most of this stuff you will see covered in outside of the Gospels, where Paul is dealing with the Greek culture.
Didn't they have the bathhouses, didn't David look on Bathsheba like a bathhouse? So I was back in...
Well, in that instance, I think that David was in his palace and he looked down, there in the city, and a lot of times they would, like in the evenings, they would take baths on the rooftops.
Okay, that's where you see Bathsheba.
So, that's where he would have seen that. But that was common in that day. It was also common in this day too, because they're in the city. They still continued building houses where the roof of one house, because of the hillsides, the roof of one house was actually, somebody's kind of front deck.
It's still like that.
Yeah, it's still like that today. The Greeks built their houses a little different than the Jews did, but that did play a part. Again, the architecture there, you can read into some of the New Testament there where that comes into play, like the story of the friends delivering the paralytic through the roof. If you understand that architecture, you understand how they did that. So there were some things like that that you can find. Social classes. Rich and poor, that was about it. There really wasn't a middle class. And the reason that there wasn't really a middle class is because there was such a large slave population. So slaves did most of the work for the rich. So there was either rich or poor. So as you read the New Testament, you can see some of that culture play through. Many of Jesus' parables, he talks about landowners who had great wealth and how they had servants. And so you see these things play out. Another thing was slavery. Slavery was massive, and no matter what you hear, America didn't invent it. Our founding fathers didn't invent it. It existed long, long before anybody ever hit the shores of this continent. Slavery has existed in every single civilization that has ever existed. We did not perfect it. If you look at some of the tactics that some people used in slavery, it was way more cruel, way more brutal than a lot of things that happened here. And I'm not trying to whitewash what happened here. It was atrocious. It shouldn't have never happened. Thank God we corrected it. But, slavery was bad here. But it has existed outside these shores, and it was really bad, and they had much worse conditions for longer periods of time. And so in 1st century AD, slavery was very common. Now, they had different types of slavery, and you've got to understand the context because it makes a difference on how we view it. There's also some theological elements that we will follow as we get into the New Testament. Now, one of those things is when we read the New Testament, and you'll see somebody like Paul, depending on what translation you read, sometimes he'll say, I'm a bondservant, or I am a slave. And in order to be that, what he describes himself as, in order to be a slave, you have to have a master or lord. And so generally you'll find the Greek word kurios, which is the word for lord, often associated whenever that word bondservant or slave is used by Paul. And so that's a theological concept that you'll find constructed there in the New Testament. But within the bounds of slavery, you find those who were born into slavery. You just keep seeing that, families. A lot of slaves had a lot of freedom in that day. Many of them did. They were allowed to have their own families. They were allowed to do things outside of their master's own things. And so you had a large number of those, but then you also had the really horrible part of slavery of being treated as a piece of property, being sold. And so there was some abysmal practices practiced then as well. And a lot of times, young men and especially young girls were sold into prostitution. And, there was a sex trade then, just like there is today. And if we can eradicate it, I wish we could. but, these things existed. And then there were those who volunteered themselves to be a slave. They might find themselves owing a debt or owing money, and so in order for them to repay that debt, they would make themselves a servant to their master. And we see that play out in the New Testament as well, where people have done that. The Jewish people, they had different ideas on this. If you look in the Jewish law, there were ways that a slave was to be treated fairly, humanely, not to be mistreated in any way. They were to be released from their debt after a certain number of years. Property was to be given back. So that, the Jewish law had several stipulations about how they did this. In the Greco-Roman world, they may have had a few different views on this, but they didn't really share so much the humane side of this as the Jewish people did. But also, with those who volunteered, a lot, when you read about slavery in the 1st century AD, a lot of them were, as I said, were able to do things very freely. A lot of them were able to have gather in outside groups, have meetings. They were able to go to church. A lot of them were put in charge of their master's possessions. A lot of times their masters was actually give them, like when they died, they were actually given their property and all of those things and their freedom. And so, when we talk about slavery in the 1st century, we've got to keep in mind all of these different scenarios, because all of those scenarios existed. And so, especially when we get to Philemon, which is centered around that slave and master relationship, that's what Paul deals with, so we have to understand that within its 1st century context. Another thing that we get into that plays a big part with the New Testament is morals. Oh man, look, still dealing with that today. Morals. Most of the time, whenever you find a list where somebody starts rattling off different things, normally you will find sexual immorality heading the group because it was such a problem. And the reason it was such a problem in the Greco-Roman world is mainly because a lot of their religious practices involved some sort of sexual participation. Most of the time when they would gather at one of their religious temples, they had temple prostitutes, male and female. And so there was a lot of sexual immorality going on. And that plays a part with some of the things that Paul talks about theologically in some of the letters that he wrote dealing with sexual immorality. So that's important. Some of the things we don't understand in modern culture, we have to understand 1st century culture to get what he's saying. And when we get there, it'll make a lot more sense to you. Divorce was pretty much, it was a little different than the Jewish way of doing things. You could pretty much, there was a high rate of divorce, a high rate of sexual immorality. They didn't value these things quite as much in the 1st century. Now, if you go backwards and look at the early Roman Republic, before they changed into the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, they had a lot of things that we cherished early in our civilization, like virtues. They had a lot of different virtues. One of those was family. Being respectful, things like that. A lot of different things. But over time, as the Roman Republic changed to the Roman Empire, we start seeing a lot of the same things that we're seeing today with the degradation of society. There's a lot of parallels with the late Roman Empire and our civilization today. Another thing was infanticide. That was something that they practiced quite regularly in the Greco-Roman world. A lot of times the thought was, and the reason we know this is because there's been a lot of ancient documents that have been found, that have been translated, and a lot of Romans who would write to their wife or whomever was bearing their child, and would tell them that if it's a boy, let it live. If it's a girl, set it outside. And a lot of times they would, if it was a girl, they would set it on the hillside, or they would set it in an alleyway. You know, and a lot of times this, and there was a type of abortion that was practiced in that day as well. So abortion is not a new thing. And they practiced it in that Greco-Roman world, and you know, they started viewing things very differently. And so whenever Jesus, whenever he's talking about women, or Paul is talking about women in different contexts, women were treated very differently under Christianity than anywhere else in the Roman culture, the Greco-Roman world. And that was counter-cultural. And so, you know, Jesus and his disciples would have gotten a lot of flack for including women in the religious studies, allowing them to speak and pray and study the scriptures. That would have been very difficult for them to get across, and it would have been difficult for a large portion of the culture to accept. So when we look back at those things, we look at Paul's letters, we look at things that Jesus said, those play a big part as well. Now, that doesn't mean that just because a large portion of the people believed in this didn't mean that there weren't any people who were carrying. Because there's a lot of evidence that there were people who did care and didn't like that this was happening and would do things about it. So we have the good with the bad here in this case. Another thing that takes place in that day, in that culture, was entertainment. We see that primarily with Paul's letters and his travels, and we see these things. As far as entertainment goes, plays. There was a lot of things. Of course, that was the modern movie. That was the modern DVD. They would go out and go to these big amphitheaters, and they would do these different plays. They would act out a lot of different things. So that was entertainment. Another thing was gladiator battles, where they would get in these big coliseums or other places like that, and they would battle. You would have gladiators who would battle each other. There would be slaves or even professional gladiators. They would duke it out. As that first century went on, then we started seeing the cruelty towards Christians, and they were being thrown in there into the gladiators. The wild beasts were allowed to let go and fight each other to the death. So it was a very, very cruel form of entertainment. I was reading, there was one such thing where they actually flooded a stadium and did a reenactment of a ship battle scene, and it said that there were 10,000 killed in a single day. It said that there was so much blood spilled that they had to replace the sand 3 times because of all the blood in it. So, you know, they had very cruel forms of entertainment, and the fact that it lasted so long and people enjoyed it as much as they did gives you kind of an idea of the mindset that they had. You know, they had even though pretty much everybody worshiped some god in some form, they had apathy, or not apathy. What's the word? They were not sympathetic at all. They didn't care. You know, they didn't have that virtue that you see with what Jews should have had and what the Christians had. They didn't have that. And that's not all of them. Of course, there were some that did, because there were many who were very receptive to the Christian message, and there was a lot of them who did not like any of these things, which that's what Christianity and Judaism attracted. So, and the other thing was public debate, civil discourse. And we'll talk about this in just a minute, but philosophy. There was philosophy has existed for a very, very long time. Philosophy existed several hundred years before you ever get to the 1st century AD. And philosophy is just basically just the thirst for knowledge, to have greater understanding. And that's that search for the great understanding of wisdom is basically what it boils down to. And there was a lot of different philosophical thought, and so they would have these public debates. Now we see Paul. Paul gets engaged in a lot of these philosophical debates. And it surprises me when I hear people, or Christians, who debate certain things. Like, there are Christians who, travel all over debating things that are anti-Christian. And I hear a lot of Christians saying, well, you shouldn't be arguing with these people, and you shouldn't be doing this, that, and the other. And I'm like, do you not realize that the majority of the New Testament is basically just arguing? It is Paul arguing a point. So, that to me, that's a moot point. I think Christians ought to have civil discourse. I think, that's a problem we've had in the past. We continue to have, having civil discourse, but being able to argue in a good way. And that's something we just haven't been able to do. So that was a big thing in that day, was this public debate. And they would do that. I mean, these very scholarly people would come and they would get together and they would debate these big, grand ideas. And so it's interesting to see how Paul deals with those. Another thing was business and trade. Of course, there was a lot of trade routes that went through there. But there were guilds. That's almost like the modern day unions. So the guilds back in that day, if you belonged to a guild, typically if you got down on your luck or needed help, they would tend to, be like like a union representative. They would come and maybe help you out or get you back on your feet. So, there was a lot of people that belonged to a guild, but also associated with a lot of these guilds, they were associated with one or more gods who was like the patron god of that guild. So, that was something that was involved heavily. Banking, they loaned out banking. They added interest to banking. It's very similar to how we do banking today. Creditors and things like that. So banking was a big part of the first century AD. Jesus talks about some of that. Paul talks about some of those things. Farming. Farming was pretty technological back in that day. There were some people who had actually developed a substance that they could put on the seeds themselves to keep insects from getting on them and destroying them. So, they were fairly advanced. Farming was fairly advanced even back then. Science and medicine. Now, that's something that the Jewish people really didn't want to touch on too much. And you've heard me talk about this. I think these are things today where Christians have got behind. And we just said, well, we don't need science. We don't need any of this stuff. And we've gotten behind because atheists said, hey, I'm going to use this to my advantage. Christians can use science because I think science just proves, for me, my faith is more important. I don't need anything scientific or archaeological to tell me that Jesus exists, that he did exist and did what he did. I don't need that. But to me, I think this helps the outside world when we can say, you know what, here's a Christian scientist who says, you know what, this proves what God said. Or, this archaeologist can say, the Bible's absolutely 100% true. So, science and medicine was an important part of first century AD, a big part of that culture. There were people who were very good at astrology. I should have added astronomy in there. Astrology was, astrology, that's a pagan practice. You see that in a lot of newspapers today. But I should have included astronomy. Astronomy was a big thing, and that's basically the study of the cosmos. And I'm thankful that we've got some really good Christian astronomers out there. Galileo, he was, you've heard that name before, right? That was somebody who was had a very deep Christian faith. Sir Isaac Newton was a scientist who had a deep faith in God. And so a lot of the people who are scientists that we revere were very devout Christians. And they studied the cosmos, which is different than astrology. Astronomy and astrology are two different things. But they were heavy in astrology, but also very heavy in astronomy. Surgery, they did surgery. There's proof of brain surgery. All kinds of different things, putting in stents. So I mean, they were fairly advanced. You know, they didn't have the painkillers like we got today. But you know, a lot of their practices would have been very painful. But nonetheless, they had, you know, they did a lot of surgery. Luke, he was a doctor, so Luke, no doubt, this would have been no mystery to him. Dentistry, they actually had some dentists back then where they could fill people's teeth with gold, like fillings, or sometimes they would, it's nasty, but they would take dead people's teeth and replace them with, you know, them, and kind of like dentures, you know. We don't use dead people's teeth, but, you know, they use dentures. Or sometimes they would take teeth out of animals' mouths. But those are things that happen. Religion and philosophy, these were the big things in that day. When you get into religion and philosophy, you see this a lot in the New Testament, because these were a lot of the things that Jesus and the disciples themselves, as they went along through the first century, these were things that they had to write against. So there was heavy mythology, and this was, I'm sure at some point you've probably read some Greek mythology, sometime probably way back in school, some Roman mythology. So I know everybody's heard of Zeus, or the god Saturn, or Apollo, some of these, Dionysus. These all played a part in the Greek culture. And so as we read the New Testament, some of those things come into play. Emperor worship came into play. Later in the Roman Empire, we start to see that in Paul's day. I think it started happening before Nero, but it really escalated after that. And so they just considered themselves, these emperors considered themselves that God incarnate. That God had come down. And so that became a problem in the New Testament in the first century. And then there was like mystery religions, the people that had supposed that they had these different types of wisdom or knowledge, and some of them would play off of the Christian message. And these are some of the things that you see. You see Paul write against. You see John the Apostle write against. And so just a few of these was Gnosticism. Gnosticism, or that comes from the Greek word gnosos, which means knowledge. Gnosticism was a movement that claimed to provide secret knowledge about God. Its adherents considered the biblical God, the creator of the world, to be an inferior God. In Gnostic teaching, the material world was innately evil, and thus its creator a lesser deity. So you see the Apostle John possibly dealing with these in his epistles, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. That's possibly what he's dealing with, based on some of the content that he writes, is this Gnostic stuff. And then also after the New Testament period, there are Gnostic Gospels that have been found. And then Epicureanism. The Epicureans, this school of philosophy was founded by Epicurus long before this. Its adherents sought to counter traditional views of the gods, relegating them to the region between the worlds, like basically heaven and earth, and from which they were assumed to take no notice of human affairs. Followers of Epicurus anticipated modern evolutionists in their belief in a closed universe emerging from the chance collision of atoms within a void. In terms of ethics, they regarded pleasure as the ultimate good. Pleasure for them did not signify devotion to sensual excess, but a life lived in moderation, since the traditional virtues of prudence and justice, in their view, yielded true happiness. So basically, these they kind of dealt with they had this idea that there were these demonic powers, good and bad, that would fight for you from the time you left heaven, or from the time you left earth to get to heaven. And they would kind of battle for you, depending on where you were. That's kind of how they would deal with you. So that's kind of the stuff that they taught. And then Stoicism. they were known for their high moral standards and devotion to duty. The Stoics taught that reality is ultimately material and that it is governed by a logos, a kind of fiery divine substance that pervades the cosmos and confers upon it order and direction. This logos, in their view, is also resident within people, enabling them to make sense of the universe. The goal for Stoics was thus a life lived in accordance with the nature. There was ultimately little difference in Stoic discourse between nature, logos, and God. Now, in a sense, they were on to a little bit of something, but the Stoicism is something that John, I think, tackles in his gospel, because John uses that word logos quite a bit in the first chapter of John. And he's describing Jesus as this logos because, as they viewed it, that it was interdispersed and everything. Well, the book of John tells us that there was nothing made except through Jesus. Everything was made through Jesus. And so, they were kind of on to something, but they weren't quite there. And so maybe John was teaching, in that essence, maybe John was writing that in part to them to show them that with the essence of Jesus and Him being there before the foundation of the world, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, that He was the true essence of nature. He was the true essence of everything. And so I think maybe that's what they went there. But there were some philosophical stuff there. Some of the main ones that are dealt with in the New Testament. And then education. Education was pretty important, not only to the Jewish people, but also to the Greco-Roman culture. So basically there was religious and philosophical, and a lot of times they were, in some ways, intermingled. Some of the philosophical views we went over, there's you've heard of Socrates, you've heard of Plato, those are kind of some of the forefathers of philosophy, but then there was different branches that came through them. And they would basically try to figure out how the world worked. Well, when Jesus came along, He said, here's the answers you're looking for. You've been debating for hundreds of years. Here's the answer for you. I'm the answer. Today, there are still people philosophically looking for answers when we have it right there. Jesus is the answer. So they were looking for it then, people are still looking for it now. People have not changed. But as far as Jewish thought, as far as education, obviously the Torah was big. Most kids would go to rabbi school, boys and girls. When you got to kind of that 12-year-old range, typically girls, they were out of school by that point. There was no chance of them going any further. And that's the way the culture was. When they got to that age, basically they learned the Torah so that they could learn to read and write, basic thought, communication, things like that. And then once they reached that age, they were sent, they were basically kicked out of the school, and they went back home to do chores with their mothers. The men, on the other hand, if they showed promise, they got to go on and spend time with a rabbi or different rabbis in the school, and they would start learning about the prophets and start reciting and memorizing the Psalms and different things like that. But if you didn't really show any promise, you were kicked out of rabbi school too. So everybody went to school as far as Jews were concerned. Now, what happened in the first century that had been working itself out for hundreds of years is, as we talked about last week, you had the Pharisees that were come along, and they were the biggest majority of like the religious leaders, and then you had the Sadducees, and you had their group that made up the Sanhedrin. That was the ruling body, the Jewish ruling body. Now, they had different schools of thought because there were two two frames of mind, two schools of thought in regards to how Jews viewed the Scriptures. There was the schools of Hillel, and there was the schools of Shammai. Have any of you watched the new Bible series, The Chosen? You can watch it for free. There's a Bible app, there's the app that you can get on your phone and you can watch them for free. You can order the DVDs. If you have some different types of cable service, you can get some of them on there. But they are wonderfully done. They're the best Bible series I have seen yet. They are very, very historically accurate. They're culturally accurate. And they actually brought up this in one of the episodes. So I was very highly encouraged that they're really sticking, to the historical and cultural context of that day with how they're filming this. And it is there was these schools of thought. Now, Hillel, the schools of Hillel were more liberal or more loose with their interpretation of the Scriptures, whereas Shammai was more conservative in their view of following the Scriptures. Now, a perfect example of this, one of the things that they thought about was a scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 24, where it talks about Moses, writing a divorce paper. Understanding the context, there was a particular word that they would pick out and say, okay, this is what it means. And so the school of Hillel, the way that they interpreted it, that's not interpreted that word. They had a more loose interpretation of it, and so basically their school of thought was that a husband could divorce their wife for any reason, even to the extent of the wife burning the food. They could divorce them. So you can see how very loose that interpretation was. Now, the Shammai, their interpretation of how they took that scripture is basically that the way that the scripture reads, it talks about it being the only way really to divorce a wife if she does something indecent. And so the way that Hillel described indecent was basically anything. The way that the school of thought with Shammai was that the way that they viewed indecent was something that went like against the law, like adultery, something like that, unfaithfulness in the marriage. And so they were a lot more strict on their thought and view of how divorce should be. And of course we see how Jesus handled that, because I'm sure that this thought would have come into play. Remember when Jesus was asked about divorce? And so when you look at these two schools of thought, you can see that play out in that passage. And so there were schools of thought that different Jews followed in that day. And so as you read the New Testament, you'll find some of that in there. And as I talked about last week, talked about a rabbi by the name of Gamaliel. And if you've read Acts, you've run across him because he's mentioned in Acts a couple times. That was who he studied under as a young Jew. Now Gamaliel, he was a Pharisee. Remember, he was the one who defended, who kind of stood up in the Sanhedrin and said, when the Christians were becoming more numerous and the religious body wanted to get rid of them, it was Gamaliel who stood up and said, hey, we've seen this kind of stuff happen before. We've seen leaders come in, have a gathering, and they've been put down. He said, if this gathering, if this following, if this whole Christian Jesus thing, if it all plays out, if it's of God, there is nothing that can stop it. He said, but if it's not of God, it will just falter like the other ones in the past have. So Gamaliel, even though he come from the school of Hillel, he was actually very leveled in the way that we see his responses. And I start to wonder, is because I think he was the grandson of the Hillel, the actual Hillel the Rabbi Hillel who had this school of thought. He was his grandson. So maybe he deviated away from his grandfather's school of thought a little, because it seems like he was more conservative in his thought, or at least that's the way it plays out. But anyway, these are all things. All these things that I've listed are all things that played a huge part in how we read the New Testament. If you just go into the New Testament and just read it as it is, you're going to have questions. But if you know history, if you learn the culture, if you know a little bit about those things, it'll really help you as you're reading that and help you draw out more truth than you ever thought possible. So, there's an introduction to the New Testament. A short introduction, I should say. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Anything they want to add? Are y'all excited to get into the New Testament? I hope so. We're learning more about our Lord, our Savior, the one that we're going to spend eternity with. I hope you are excited about that. All right, well, if nothing happens, then next week we'll start Matthew. Judy, would you lead us in prayer today?
Sure.
Thank you.